Hey everyone, and welcome to the September 8th, 2020 edition of the Tom's Hardware Podcast. I'm Avram Pilch, Tom's Hardware Editor-in-Chief. I'm joined, as always, by Associate Editor Les Pounder and Raspberry Pi expert Ash Puckett, and our special guest this week, in honor of Star Trek Day, is Gabe Emerson. Hi, Gabe.
Hello.
Who has made a Raspberry Pi powered tricorder. But that's not the only thing that you do, Gabe. Tell us about yourself. What are some of the other types of projects that you do?
Well, I've got a few projects. I have a YouTube channel. It's the Save It for Parts channel. And many projects revolve around boats. I grew up in Alaska. I grew up on a lot of boats. And so most of my projects have something to do with that. But I also have things like potato cannons, technology. I have a monorail. You might see my shirt here, the Monorail Society. I bought a surplus monorail from the Minnesota Zoo when they closed that down, and it's a full-sized one that you can sit inside, and we use that as a weekend cabin. So those are just some of the things that I'm up to. I've got a lot of different projects going on, and the tricorder was one of them on my website, and that's what I'm here today to show off.
Wow, that's really cool. So before we get into the tricorder, I bet everyone's fascinated to know that you own a monorail. Like how many cars is it, and how do you enjoy it?
Well, it's 6 cars, so it's a full train, and we had to move them out to my friend's property one at a time. Each one fit on a trailer, and we loaded them from the zoo. We managed to get them onto a trailer, moved them out there, hired a local company with a crane to pick each one up and set it down in a line so there's still a train. And I ended up keeping the first 2, and then some friends of mine ended up buying some of the other ones from me. So it's almost like a condo where it's each person has a train car where they can camp in for the winter or the night or weekends or whatnot. And yeah, we thought that would be easier than tents for some reason. It's just kind of a remote property off the grid, and we've been out there camping sometimes, and we thought, it's a lot of work to set up a tent every time we go out there, so let's put a lot more work into it and install a train that we can camp in. So yeah, it turned into a fun project.
Do you have pictures of this somewhere that people can see?
Yeah, I have a website at saveitforparts.com, and I do have some photos and some video on my YouTube channel. And that's, if you look on YouTube under Save It for Parts, I should come up, and I'll have a bunch of my projects on there.
That is really cool. Now, you haven't done a lot of Raspberry Pi projects. Is this your first major Raspberry Pi project, the tricorder?
It is, yeah. It's my first major one. Somebody actually gave me 2 Raspberry Pis. I think they're the Model 3. And I had done another video where I did like a little gaming system, and somebody said, well, that would have been way easier with a Raspberry Pi versus the tablet that you used. So I was given 2 of these, and I slapped one into a waterproof case, threw some sensors on it, and I'm now on my 3rd iteration of it. I've actually redone the case a couple times. This is what it looks like now. The previous case it was in, it just didn't fit. I was trying to make this kind of 90-degree USB dongle so I could pack everything into a tiny little waterproof case, and it just didn't work. So I'm on version 3, I guess, at the moment, and I just have been learning quite a bit about the Raspberry Pi. I'm still very much a Pi noob. I've done some Linux stuff. I've done some Linux server stuff. I do a lot of my video editing on Linux, but I'm still very much a noob. I still have to go online and steal other people's code if I want to do anything complicated. So it's a real learning experience for me.
So tell us about the tricorder. What does it do?
Sure. Let me see if I can pull up some apps on it here. One of the cool things is this AMG 8833 sensor, and that's a thermal sensor. I don't know how much you can see on the video here, but it's a thermal imager like a FLIR. But this is the bargain basement version. It only costs about $50 for that 8833 sensor. It's only 8x8 pixels, and There's some interpolation with Pygame and SciPy where it tries to give you a little better picture than 8x8. But basically, you can detect thermal energy. So you can see in the dark, you can see animals, you can see hot equipment. You can use it to find out if, say, you have a circuit breaker that's too hot or an electronic component that's too hot. You can aim that at your board and see, what's generating the most heat. That's kind of the most fun one that I've been working on. You'll also notice I have an antenna on here, and I have this little RTL SDR dongle, and that's a little USB software-defined radio. And so that gives you like a spectrum analyzer and radio scanner and lets you play around with the RF spectrum and see what's going on in your local broadcast airwaves. So those are the two things that work the best. I have a couple other sensors that I haven't quite gotten to work yet, but those are the two things that I focus the most on is those sensors.
You've got a speaker set up to play some of the RF feeds it can pick up on?
That's been a problem going back and forth. I think that I killed the onboard sound on the Pi. I'm not sure how, but I think I might have killed the sound card. And I've got this little USB sound card that I'm still trying to fit in the current case. I need a little USB jumper so that it fits. I'm still running into some space issues in this case. So currently that's on the table to work on, but it's kind of an ongoing project to get the sound working.
With this being your first Raspberry... Oh.
Sorry, Ash, go on.
I was just going to ask really quick, with this being your first Raspberry Pi project, compared to some of the other hardware you've used to set up things in the past, what were your impressions? Do you think it's more beneficial in some areas, less?
I'm really enjoying it. I really like the Raspberry Pi platform. I went a little crazy. I got these for free, like I said, and then I went crazy on eBay and I bought a bunch of accessories. I bought those sensors. I bought some screens. I have this other device that I haven't had time to set up. It's supposed to be an RFID reader, so I might try to do something with that, either local RFID smart cards or some kind of long-range RFID scanner. That's kind of a project for the future. And then I've got a to-do list of things I'd like to do with the Raspberry Pi. I've been doing a little bit of Wi-Fi scanning, some war driving stuff. I used to do that back in the old days when you did it with a Pringles can, so it's kind of fun to get back into that again. And then there's a fellow named JC Ryuta, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but he's got a really cool project where you can fingerprint electronics with the RTL SDR and find out, say, for example, you've got an Android phone versus an Apple phone, which one puts out what kind of signature in the RF spectrum of just background noise. And that's something I'm really interested in. I've been playing around with that, but I haven't quite gotten it to a level where I can show it off yet. And then there's some other things I'd love to do with the Pi. I'd love to do a ground penetrating radar. I'd love to do a side scan sonar for my boats. I don't know how to do those. I don't know how to get started. So those are going to be far down the road for that kind of project.
That's brilliant. What software is tying it all together? What programming language are you using to get all this to work?
A lot of it's in Python, and I'm not a Python expert. I have a computer science degree, and I've honestly not used it all that much. I think most of my CS stuff was in JavaScript, Java, C++, so Python has a little bit of overlap, but it's a little new to me. I can fake it. I can steal people's code online. I can copy things off the internet, and but I'm not an expert by any means on that stuff. So I poke around at it and I learn as I go, I guess.
Yeah, I think you've chosen the right language, considering the Raspberry Pi is your machine right now, because there's a hell of a lot of projects on Python for the Raspberry Pi, and there's a lot of knowledge out there that you can tap into.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. I have a question for you. So let's look at the device again. How did you choose the casing?
So like I said, this is the third case that I've got, and this used to be a waterproof speaker. This was kind of in the days before Bluetooth. You'd put your iPod in here. I think this was even in the days before Android phones or iPhones. You'd put your MP3 player in this waterproof case, and it had a built-in speaker. And I've actually pulled some of that out to make room for the Pi. I might put it back in once I get the sound card working, but it's theoretically waterproof. I've not tested it. I did cut some holes in it. I've got my AMG 8833 sensor peeking out the back here. If I get my DHT11 sensor working for humidity, I might have to cut a hole for that, but that's another thing I may have killed by screwing around with the wrong voltages and whatnot. So that one doesn't work right now. This does fold up. If I fold my antenna down and take everything apart here, sorry, it'll take me a second here, but I can actually fold the entire thing up, clip these down, and it's waterproof. I can throw it in a backpack. I can bring it on a boat, and I can bring it out in the field and do some kind of, away team missions with it, I guess.
What are you doing for battery?
Currently, it's a USB battery bank that I've cannibalized a little bit. So I've taken the case apart so it fits in here better. And then it's just running a little USB cord over to the Pi. And I think it's currently at 85%. I need to cut out some of my mesh here so I can see the readout. And then this other USB cable is just to recharge it. So it's essentially a gutted USB power bank.
Wow. Yeah, that seems to be the battery of choice, is to use USB power banks. However, my son and I were having a debate this week about what type of battery to use for a project we're working on, because a USB power bank wouldn't quite fit in the spot that we're trying to put it on.
Sure.
Just to throw another little thing out, my son and I have the Sphero Rover here, which is something that's pretty cool that you can use. You can buy the Sphero Rover. It's actually spelled RVR, and it's a standalone remote control car robot that you can program with your phone, but it also has 4 pins and an API that will let you interface with the Raspberry Pi, and it has this plastic piece on top that lets you mount. So a lot of people are using the RVR with Raspberry Pis. Right now we're having some trouble getting it to recognize the pins at the moment, but one of the great issues is, now this is good because you actually are getting power from the RVR, so it will go in here. But if we wanted to, say, supplement the power by getting a battery for the Pi on something like this, or on another car robot like the STS Pi that I have in this drawer over here, right? It's really hard. Now this one we managed to get like a small Anchor USB charger, but there are a lot of chargers out there. I know Les has had some experience with this, that are actually hats where you can put a charging hat, but they're quite expensive, right? There's like the Pi Juice is one that's $100 or something close to that.
There's two that I can list off the top of my head. It's the MoPi, which was the first battery backup for the Pi. That was created about 6 or 7 years ago when the Pi first came out. And it's Pi Juice. That's the one that has a Motorola battery and a hat that goes on top of the Pi. And it'll either trickle charge the battery on top of the Pi, or if the power goes off, it will flip over to that battery and power the Pi from it for a certain amount of time. So it's really handy for off-grid projects.
Yep. So what type of battery life are you getting with that, Gabe? Have you managed to measure it?
I haven't had it out in the field yet. I think when I've had it sitting here at the desk just running with like one app at a time, like say I'm running the RTL SDR. I'll pull that up again here. So this is the SDR running a scan of our local police trunked radio system. I don't know how well you can really see the little screen on the broadcast, but it seems to have about 45 minutes to an hour of using that. And then it takes quite a while to recharge that little battery bank. It's not a great battery bank. It's honestly, I tried to find the smallest one I could find on eBay, so it's not the best one, it's not the fastest one, and it's not the most efficient one. It's just the smallest, and that was about the only consideration I had at the time. But it gives me almost an hour, so I'm pretty pleased with that.
Yeah, that's really quite decent. So, speaking of other projects, Les, I know you've got a really exciting project to show us involving Flight Simulator.
I have, yes. So a few weeks ago, Microsoft released Microsoft Flight Simulator, the 2020 update, and it was quite popular. But I saw something online that was really piqued my interest, and it was the retro versions of those flight simulators for the old IBM PCs of the era, the 1980s, 1990s. And someone was emulating this machine in the browser on GitHub, and I thought, I wonder if we could control that with a Raspberry Pi. And so I built something. So I'll just do a screen share now so you can see what I built as the finished project. So that is the finished project. That is a Raspberry Pi in the right-hand side of the screen, Raspberry Pi 4, and a load of wires going between that and a control box. And that control box is really just emulating keyboard, like a standard USB keyboard with the GPIO using a library called Pinput. PYN put, and it's fantastic. It's really easy to use, and it allowed me to build a flight simulator really quickly. So I'm actually going to play it live, and I apologize, I can't fly a plane. So this is going to be fun, he says. So I shall share that screen now. So this is a live feed from my Raspberry Pi 4 on my desk, and I'm playing it via a capture card using VLC. So there's so many layers that are creating latency. And in the bottom right of the screen, you can see a terminal window, and that is showing the keyboard inputs. If I move the joystick left or right or down, up, this is my little debug system to prove that it's all working. I press the gears, I change the views, you can see all that. So if I'm going to take off now, I'll get it to a nice view so I can see my takeoff. Engine to full. And it's saying I've stalled already, not been took off yet. So let's bring the gear in. Let's change view to something so I can actually fly it. And let's just go left a bit.
That's so cool.
I told you I can't fly. Now I'm doing a loop back to the airport.
Does it feel as fun as it looks?
It's really good fun. It's really difficult to control because you have to compensate. When you turn in one direction, you have to compensate by pressing the joystick the other way. Otherwise, you lose control completely. And this is with the slowest plane. If I was playing this with the Learjet, it would be instant crash. I am completely useless with that one. But I'm controlling this right now from the controller on my desk with a load of wires. This is going to be a crash, I'm afraid. I can't pull out of this. There you go. But I can play Flight Simulator in the browser with a Raspberry Pi using this control. And I would say the actual electronics for this have cost me, I'll round it up in dollars, about $35 in total for the electronics. And the biggest part of that price was the joystick. The joystick is a CCTV joystick for a CCTV camera that I found online. But yeah. Even me muted.
For those watching, can you show it again?
The joystick. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the overhead camera is not working tonight. It's having a night off. But that is a CCTV camera controller. And a load of buttons, little push buttons, try and get it in shot.
Yes.
There we go.
That is really impressive. Now, I want to point out to the audience that you don't actually need to do what Les did in terms of building your own joystick and buttons in order to play an old flight simulator on the Raspberry Pi. What do you have to do?
If you just want to play a normal flight simulator, you can use a USB joystick quite easily with the Pi. It will detect it. Use USB joypad. The flight simulator I've been messing around with has complete keyboard interface. So you can just play straight away with your keyboard. And it's actually a little bit easier at times, but I still manage to stall the plane quite often.
But where can folks go if they want to learn how to make this project themselves?
Well, we've written a guide on Tom's Hardware that I wrote a couple of weeks ago now, and it's got a full guide on the electronics build. and the software build for this, which is entirely written in Python.
Indeed. So folks can, if they want to invest the time and they have joysticks and buttons that they want to connect, you can check out our tutorial on tomshardware.com, and it will show you how to make your own flight simulator controller. Speaking of things you can make yourself, Ash, you've been making a webcam with Raspberry Pi that you want to show everyone.
Yeah, right now with everything going on, everybody's working from home, and I thought maybe there's some kind of project that I can show off that people can use to help while they're working from home, and that is a Raspberry Pi webcam. So let's say you've got a Zoom meeting coming up, and your regular webcam, it's kaput, it's not working. But if you're watching this podcast, you probably have a lot of Raspberry Pis around. So this is how you can solve that problem with a Raspberry Pi and a camera module. So what I've got off to the side is a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus that I had handy, and connected to it is a camera module. And using some software called Motion, I was able to create an IP, like a feed over IP of that video camera feed. So what I'm going to do is adjust my camera here. Now this here is my camera. If I turn it around, you can see me. And the neat thing about Motion, I'm going to switch over to show the terminal for this. The neat thing about Motion is that it lets you adjust a lot of details, like down to the frame size, the frame rate, the size of the video feed. You can turn on or off all kinds of different streaming options. But it's really useful to set up. Now, you can also take things a step farther, and let's say you don't want to access your camera from a browser window, which is what I'm doing for this feed right now. The camera is actually going through a browser window, and then I'm using an application to stream it to you guys right here. You can go a step farther and actually create a USB Raspberry Pi webcam, which is something that Avram has done in the past. And if you want to check that out, go to tomshardware.com, do a search for Raspberry Pi webcam, and I think he mentioned updating that process. There's a new way to go about creating a USB webcam. But
yeah, we're actually updating our story on it, but we do have a story on how to create a webcam that you can easily stream from any Raspberry Pi, but there's also some additional steps that folks have come up with to actually use the gadget mode on Raspberry Pi Zero. Gabe, have you gotten to work with the Raspberry Pi Zero at all yet?
No, I've not. I just have those. I have two of these Raspberry Pi 3s, and I've not branched out into any of the other versions yet. I've thought about buying some more, upgrading to the 4, trying out the 0, but I haven't dipped my fingers in those yet.
Yeah, so one of the cool things about the Zero that I think a lot of our listeners know, but maybe not everybody, is that it has what's called USB gadget mode, which means that it can be seen as a USB device by a Windows PC, probably also by a Linux PC. So you can actually, if you code it right, you could actually make it appear as a device in Device Manager in Windows. And not only could you potentially use that for turning it into a webcam, which is something that we're looking to update our story with, but also you could use it for things like turning it into, I think, a storage drive. You can do all kinds of cool things with it because it's seen as Storage Plus. You can actually use the USB port on it as if it's Ethernet, so therefore you can plug it directly into the USB port on your computer, and it can get internet that way, so you don't even need to have it connected to Wi-Fi or actual Ethernet or anything like that. And of course, Raspberry Pi Zero is just $5, and Raspberry Pi Zero W is just $10. So those are just so cheap. I keep a pack. I keep them like chewing gum and hand them out. One year, I actually. Oh, you were going to say, Ash?
I'll just say, on that note, while you're talking about the Raspberry Pi Zero with the USB gadget mode, there's a project that I featured. It was a Raspberry Pi project that I featured over the last couple of weeks. It was called, I'm sorry, the guy who created it, he used a Raspberry Pi Zero and stuck it inside of an old Apple iSight webcam. And that webcam is from the early 2000s. The quality's not that great, but using the Pi Zero with the camera module inside, he was able to make a fully functional iSight webcam, but it's just a Raspberry Pi Zero.
Yeah, it's impressive what you can do with them. I like to give them as gifts to people when it used to be safe to go to the store, I used to go to. We have a store around here in the New York area called Micro Center, which I believe they have in other part. Which I know there's maybe 20 of them across the country, but not so much in the Midwest or the West Coast. And they are like the best place for Raspberry Pi Zero for $5. But you can only buy one at a time. So one holiday season, I wanted to get Raspberry Pi Zeros for everyone, the Tom's Hardware staff, and I just had to go to the store like 10 times, and every time buy a 0W, and then I installed Raspberry Pi OS on them and put like a little video greeting on the desktop, and then told everybody that if you want your holiday card, you have to boot this up and try to and watch it. So big fan of Raspberry Pi Zero 0W. I have several zeros in my lineup of, I think, now 15 Raspberry Pis in this house or something like that. As we've talked on prior episodes of the show, once you get into Raspberry Pi, you just start having more and more of them because you don't want to take them out of the project that you put them into, right? Speaking of things that you can do with your Raspberry Pi, especially your Raspberry Pi 4, wanted to talk briefly about and share my screen, talk briefly about how to boot off of USB on your Raspberry Pi 4. And actually this method will work, I think, on any Raspberry Pi, not just the 4, but it's something that's specifically just been updated recently so that it's easier to do now than ever before with your firmware. So what I have here, and I'm showing here, is Raspberry Pi 4 running Raspberry Pi OS. And I've already taken a lot of these steps, so I'm just going to show you briefly how you would take them to fix it so that instead of booting off of your micro SD card, you can boot off of an external SSD or a USB flash drive. Obviously, a USB SSD is going to give you much better performance than most flash drives. But the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you are 100% up to date. Now, if you have just burned a new Raspberry Pi OS card, you will be up to date. But if you are taking an existing card that you maybe made more than 2 weeks ago, then you'll want to make sure that you go in and you do all the updates. That means doing sudo apt update, which is going to take a couple minutes if you haven't done it in a while, then doing sudo apt full-upgrade, which is going to do a really major upgrade. And then, just for good measure, you will also want to do a third command, which is sudo space rpi-update, and that will update you to the latest firmware, and then you will be asked to reboot. Now, when I try to do it on here, it's going to tell me, I think, that my firmware is already up to date because I just did this. After I've done all of that, I want to make sure once again that I am running the latest version of the firmware. So to find out, I would type sudo space rpi-eeprom-update, hit enter, and it will tell me what version of the firmware I'm running. Now, if you're running a version that is September 3rd, 2020 or later, I don't think there is later at this moment, but maybe you're listening to this in the future, then you're good for USB booting. But if not, what you'll want to do is you'll want to type sudo rpi-eeprom-update, put a -d and a -a, and it will then tell you to reboot after it's downloaded the latest firmware. Now, once you've done that, your next step, or if you had already burned a new card, your first step or your next step will be to go to Raspberry config, which I think most people are familiar with how to get to. So once you get into the Raspberry config software, you will want to go to boot options, which is number 3 on the list. And you will want to go to boot B5 boot ROM version. There you will choose latest. There's 2 choices, latest or default. You will choose latest. And when it asks you if you want to reset boot ROM to default, you will say no. Your next step will be to go back to boot options and go to boot order. There you will select USB boot and say OK. So now you will probably be asked to if you want to reboot, but we're not going to reboot right now just because I'm showing you things. But if you were really doing it, you'd probably want to reboot at that point. Now, the last thing that you need to do is you need to actually create a USB flash drive or USB external USB SSD that has your operating system on it. And the easiest way to do this is to go in Raspberry Pi OS, to go to the Start menu, go to SD card copier under Accessories, and pick out your source device, which is the micro SD card you have in, and your copy to device, which is the USB drive that you now have plugged into probably your USB 3 port, and then hit Start. This will take a few minutes, especially depending on how large of a card you're copying. And when it's done, you should be able to shut down, remove the micro SD card that you had in there, and then reboot using only the USB drive. So that is how you do it. We have an article on how to boot off of USB 4 and on our site, which explains exactly how to do this, so you don't need to memorize this. Dave Jones says, no need to RPI update for USB boot, but you do need to reboot after apt upgrade to permit the bootloader to refresh the 4's boot EPROM. Les, do you have any feedback on that?
If Dave Jones has said it, it's true. I've worked with Dave a very long time, and he is Mr. Raspberry Pi. He knows it.
So I guess it's if you manage to get it to the September 3rd or later, which I guess the safest thing to do is just check by typing, after you've done all the updates and you've rebooted, just check and make sure that your firmware date is September 3rd or later. And if it's not, if it is, then you don't need to run the update. And if you attempt to run the update, it will just tell you that you've already updated. So seems like you may not need to run the EPROM update, but I think the bottom line is a few months ago, we actually wrote an article on how to do this, but now it's gotten easier because it's part of the current stable regular version of Raspberry Pi OS, whereas before it was kind of an experimental firmware that was safe, but you had to go jump through a few more hoops to make it work. Now you're running new cards, you run some updates, you're golden to do this, which is great because you will see dramatically faster, not really dramatically faster boot times, I think, but dramatically faster application opens and copying and file copies and things like that if you use an external SSD. So something for Gabe to keep in mind too for one of your next projects if you want it to go a little bit faster.
Sure.
One thing I have not seen, and I ask the audience this too, is a really good quality USB flash drive that's fast for using on your Raspberry Pi. I find if you use an SSD in an enclosure, it works, although you may need extra power. You may need it to be, you may not be able to do it off of bus power, but I have not yet found a really compelling USB flash drive that does this because they tend to, I guess the random reads and random writes on USB flash drives just aren't very good. And when I've tested it, it hasn't been very good. Has anybody else found a USB flash drive that's particularly good at this? I'm eager to hear of one, but so far the search continues. Obviously, it's easy enough to attach an SSD, but SSDs take up more space. So if you could get a nice tiny USB flash drive, it would be a lot easier to fit something like that in your tricorder than to fit a USB, to fit a SATA drive or even an NVMe drive in an enclosure. So that's something we continue to look for. Maybe someone who makes flash drives will pick up on this and try to make one that's really good for booting. We do know that Eben Upton, when he was on the show, founder of Raspberry Pi, when he was on the show several weeks ago, hinted that the compute module for the Raspberry Pi 4 might support PCIe, which means that if you made something with a compute module, you could theoretically go straight to connecting it to a PCI NVMe drive if you had it on the right kind of board. But that's a higher level of complication. Anyhow, I want to thank our special guest, Gabe Emerson. Where can folks, once again, find all the cool things you're doing?
Well, you can go on my website, which is saveitforparts.com, or you can check me out on YouTube. I've got the Save It for Parts channel, and so if you search for that, or if you go to youtube.com/saveitforparts, I should come up, and you can see this project, you can see the Pi Tricorder, and you can see some of my other projects. So,
great, thank you. So,
oh,
sorry, you were going to say, Ash?
We didn't mention it before, but I have to get this out there for our readers. I'm sorry, for our viewers and our listeners. When you go check out Gabe's work, look up his steam-powered goose.
That is
exactly
fun.
what it looks like.
Yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. I can't wait till you put Raspberry Pi in the monorail.
It was originally an analog computer, so that might take some work.
Well, when you do that, when you put Raspberry Pi in the monorail, you got to come on and do a broadcast on the monorail to show us that. That would be awesome. Anyway, thanks to everyone for listening and watching. As always, we're on at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 7:30 p.m. BST on Tuesdays with the Tom's Hardware Podcast, and you can always find us on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to audio podcasts. See you next week.